In today's video, I'm going to take on post-war economic change in Birmingham. This is the second part of the OCR A-level case study you need to know, where we've already looked at what the characteristics were like before the change, and now we're going to look at the actual economic change, the players that were involved, and what happened afterwards. So we've got up to the point where Birmingham, it's post-war, it's 1950s, it's got a really large population of 1.1 million, showing that it's a very important manufacturing centre. Then we start to see this big economic change that happens after this, which is an area of industrial decline. Before that, we should see where Birmingham was. So it's a prosperous city, very wealthy. In terms of UK unemployment and Birmingham unemployment, Birmingham's unemployment was below 1% in the 50s and 60s, and the UK average was about 2% at this point, so it was pretty good on a national level. However, by the 80s, fast forwarding 30 odd years, that had hugely changed. The UK average was about 12-13% by 1982, but Birmingham was significantly above that at 19.4%. So we've seen a huge shift from being a very high employment area to an area of mass unemployment. And this was largely due to some significant economic changes in key industries that started to happen from the 70s onwards. One example, the metal manufacturing, which had been dominating Birmingham's landscape for many, many years, went from 22% in 1950 to 12% by 1980, and for less than 5% by 2013. Similarly, car manufacturing, another dominant one that had started to appear in 1901, it was 11% by 1951, and then 3% by 2013. So huge losses in these main manufacturing industries. This was because there was a series of actions done by several players that actually led to these economic changes, and I'm going to go through the players involved in this industrial decline. We start with something happening in the Middle East that affected Birmingham. So in the 70s, there was an Arab-Israeli war in 1973, and different nations backed different sides, either the Arab side or the Israeli side. And unfortunately for the Arabs, many of the Western states actually supported Israel, so the Israeli side, America being the most dominant one, but lots of other Western nations followed suit. The Arab nations decided to respond to this in a very unique way. So OPEC, which is a group of petroleum exporting countries, made up of largely Arab states, so Saudi Arabia being the most dominant one, they decided that they didn't like the Western nations that supported Israel, and so to react to that, they actually started to embargo oil. They used oil as a weapon by saying, we're not going to give you any more, we're going to ban the supply of it to your Western countries and see how your economies fare. So this group, OPEC, the Organisation of Petroleum Exporting Countries, were a very powerful player in what would happen to Birmingham later on. We see what happened as a consequence. If you stop oil being supplied, then prices go up. So the 1973 oil crisis meant that barrels went from $3 a barrel to $12 a barrel, with a huge hike in the price. This obviously had knock-on effects for lots of countries, especially Western nations where the supply was limited. It meant that petrol prices went up because there wasn't enough oil, and that means petrol prices and energy prices went up. This therefore led to Birmingham's demise in some areas because manufacturing in Birmingham was very reliant on cheap energy prices. And so if you take away cheap energy, all the transport costs, all the manufacturing costs go up. And so Birmingham has to start making cutbacks because they can't actually run their industry at the same level as they were before. This was coupled at the same time by the fact that the car manufacturing industry was hit by competition from foreign TNCs. So we had OPEC, one key player, and now we've got TNCs that are compounding the issue, foreign TNCs in car manufacturing. An example of this is the Japanese car manufacturers Nissan and Toyota. They started to export cars to the UK in the 70s, and these was because they were often better value, more reliable, and often more fuel efficient. You want them to be more fuel efficient when the price of fuel has gone up. And so these cars became popular. They weren't only cars in that area to become popular in the UK. Volkswagen from Germany and Renault from France started to import more cars as well. And so those traditional British cars, which most people have bought, started to have competition, and therefore sales started to go down. If Birmingham's a big car manufacturing base, it obviously feels the effects of that. As the car manufacturing started to decline, the trade unions that ran these companies started to strike. British Leyland is a really good example of a company in Birmingham that started to strike a lot. And so trade unions became key players. They were key in shutting down factories, and they were therefore altering the future of Birmingham. It could have worked out, and they could have had higher wages and more success, but unfortunately it actually led to lots of investors being detracted from going there. They didn't want to go to an area where people were striking, and so they decided not to invest in that area. So this led to further decline. So OPEC caused some of the initial problems. We've had car manufacturing from like Japan that are compounding the issue. Now we've got trade unions who are altering the state of play. And we can even see that central government get involved in well. They do this in the fact that some foreign TNCs decided to actually set up factories in the UK. Nissan in Sunderland and Honda in Swindon, they wanted to take advantage of those EU markets by being able to ship their cars into the EU without having to pay tariffs. And the central government actually helped do this. They gave tax breaks to companies like Honda and grants, and said to them, we'll give you some incentives to come and actually put your company here, especially if you put it in an area with high unemployment. So that's why they went to places like Swindon, which had a lot of the railway employment that had disappeared after the 1940s. The unfortunate thing is that this key player could have put it in Birmingham, but unfortunately they didn't. And therefore there were no foreign car manufacturing TNCs actually put in Birmingham. And so Birmingham's manufacturing base continued to decline even further. Alongside this, the city council decided to clear slums, all the slums that had started to appear. They decided to clear it as part of something called a comprehensive redevelopment programme. But as they were clearing their slums, they had to get rid of lots of the small and medium enterprises that Birmingham had become famous for. So this city of 1,000 trades, all these small businesses were demolished in the process. And when they said, here's some new premises you can use, unfortunately, most of those small businesses couldn't afford them. So we saw lots of small businesses start to decline as Birmingham went through this huge redevelopment programme because they couldn't afford the rents. So we've seen economic change. I'm now going to look at housing change in Birmingham. So after World War II, the housing stock in Birmingham was pretty poor quality, partly because lots of houses had been destroyed, 5,000 during bombing in World War II, but also we just had really large-scale slums that had started to exist. 110,000 houses were of a very, very poor substandard. So the council started to clear slums, and what they replaced them with was these 400 tower blocks, which they built in the 50s and 60s. Over 81,000 homes built between 1945 and 1970. This was happened all over the country, but in Birmingham there was obviously a lot of them, and they weren't all high-rise flats, but they were often better conditions than the slums. Some of these were social housing, but they were the better affordable homes for people who'd been living in pretty substandard conditions. However, this started to redistribute the population. So lots of those slums had been in the centre of Birmingham, but when they built these huge tower blocks, they actually built them on housing estates on the rural urban fringe. Castle Vale being an example in the northeast. And so people actually moved out of the centre. We also saw people move out of the centre as they moved to new towns which were being set up. And so we saw this migration of people away from the slums to the edges of the city. We kind of saw, as people moved out, therefore the industry started to change in Birmingham, and so services became more important as we got into the 80s and 90s. And so we see this flow of people commuting back from their jobs, from their areas where they live in the suburbs, into the centre where most of these services would have been based. The government decided that they didn't want the city to get too big and didn't want too much urban sprawl, and so the local and national government set up a green belt to stop the urban sprawl. And this had a knock-on effect in that areas that were close to that green belt, where they had good transport links but were really, really close to that nice green space, really increased in land value. So Solihull is a really good example, a knoll just outside it. They're very, very expensive areas because they're in this prime position next to the green belt, right on the edge of the city. The last thing I'm going to discuss is demographic change. The major change that changed Birmingham, we said it was predominantly white before the 1950s, was the international migration after World War II from the Caribbean, from South Asia and the Far East. These were often economic migrants moving to places like Birmingham and London for jobs that had people had lost those jobs after World War II. The labour force had died off, and so they were people to go and replace those jobs. It was a place of lots of economic opportunity. We see that these migrants often tended to cluster in certain bits of the inner city where there was cheap housing. So we see here on the left there's a big Asian community just outside the CBD, and same for the black community. So these are long-standing communities where people migrated into those cheaper housing. As the service industry grew in the city, lots of opportunities came available for migrants, which encouraged them to go there, and often these were in low-skilled jobs. Examples here are taxi drivers, hospital porters, or in retail. So Birmingham became a real place of opportunity for migrants to come to, offering established communities and lots of economic opportunity. As migrants started to move to Birmingham, they started to actually bring their cultures and beliefs, and therefore they altered the built environment. Here's the Birmingham Central Mosque, which is a building for the Muslim community, which was built because there was a large migration of Muslims into the city since the 1960s. We also see key services and new services popping up to support those migrants. So money transfer centres, we can see the Western Union, lots of these in the centre of Birmingham, and that's because lots of migrants want to be able to sell remittances back to their home nation. So these services has popped up to meet the demand. It's not just money transfer centres, but actually migrants set up businesses. So the Balti Triangle is an area of Birmingham where there's lots of Indian and other ethnic restaurants that have been set up by migrants coming into the city. Not only have they actually brought businesses and services, so kind of fabric shops, but also they've changed the culture. So the Balti was invented in Birmingham. It's a dish that was invented in Birmingham. So migrants have not only changed demography, but they've also actually changed the culture of Birmingham. The last thing to really discuss is that Birmingham not only has a more ethnically diverse population than lots of other parts of the UK, but it's very youthful compared to lots of parts of the UK and England. The national average in terms of ages is shown by this blue line. And what we can actually see, if we look closer, is the one behind it is the Birmingham age pyramid. And therefore we can see that there's more people that are 24 or younger, 38% compared to the national of 31, and there is more people that less people that are above 65. So Birmingham has become incredibly more diverse since the 50s, and it's also become younger since the 1950s. So we can see that there has been huge economic and social change. This has affected the built environment, but also the structure of the population.